May I speak in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Today, we're observing the Epiphany. It's time to break out the Christmas carols one more time, to rearrange the manger scene so the Magi complete their journey from other parts of the church, and we're able to meet the child Jesus one more time this year. It's a familiar part of the Christmas story, and at its center are the wise men from the east who follow a star to Jerusalem, and after a meeting with King Herod, proceed to Bethlehem to worship and give gifts to the King of the Jews, whom they came searching for, following directions given to them by the heavens. While I was reading the story of the Magi from today's gospel, taken from the Gospel of Matthew, three questions came to mind about the wise men. Firstly, who are they, or who were they? What were they looking for, and what did they find? The most important fact about the Magi is that they were not from Judea. They were from as far away from Judea as is reasonably possible, from the part of the world which is now known as Iran, then called Persia. They were also not Jews. When Herod, who was from Judea and who was Jewish, wanted to know what these foreign men could be on about with their talk of stars and portents, he turned to the scriptures written for his people, the words of the prophets of the Bible. These prophets tell of a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. These Magi were not of God's people Israel. They themselves were not priests or scribes or even kings. They were people who read the stars for signs and interpreted them for those who made decisions. It may sound a bit foreign to us, but in the ancient world, the skies were a portal that revealed the workings of the universe. Well, astrology may seem strange to us. What should be understandable to us 2,000 years later is the idea that there is order to the universe, the idea that existence has meaning, and that knowing and understanding that meaning is worth doing. That desire to search and know is what sent them out on their quest, and it brings our inquiry to my second question. What is it that they were looking for? According to their own words, they were looking for the child who's been born King of the Jews, and they wanted to find him and worship him. Now, why would they want to do that? One answer is that the Gospels are full of people who do the right thing, who call Jesus by the right title, for instance, but who don't realize that is what they're doing. They are intending to say one thing, but the evangelist knows, and we the reader know, that they ironically said something quite different, but which is much closer to a truth they can barely comprehend. King of the Jews is one of those titles that could be intended by the wise men in a very literal way. They're looking for the heir to an earthly political throne and have come to pay this future ruler earthly homage. But we, the readers of this episode, know that there's a deeper meaning to this title, King of the Jews, that it means the Messiah, the anointed one, who's the fulfillment of the hope of all humanity. We, the readers, also know that when the wise men worship Jesus, they're doing the right thing, whatever their intentions. This baby is God, and it's right to worship God. This story gets across the message that the gospel is for everyone, that the work of salvation that God's been working out in Israel is now a salvation that's offered to the whole world, that the journey that these non-Jewish astrologers made to the capital of the Jewish nation and from there to the city of David is one that ought to be followed by everyone, irrespective of their ethnicity or their citizenship. That's the ultimate meaning at the root of this story, and I could end this sermon here and be satisfied I'd done my job well. Since no one objects, I'll go on. You had your chance, but you blew it. It's good that we go on because the story itself raises up some further questions. This story, whatever its origins, is meant to be believable, to make sense internally as a story. The big question that remains is, what are these Magi doing searching for the king of a marginal people under the occupation of a different foreign power? What could these men who aren't Jews, who have their own nationality, who don't worship the God of Israel, who have their own God, and who aren't subjects of the rulers of Palestine, what do they care about the King of the Jews? Why would they be searching the skies looking for portents of the birth of a king who had so very little to do with them? About a month ago, Howard Jones, a friend of Reverend Martha and an aerospace engineer with an interest in astronomy, came to give a presentation that looked at the patterns of the movements of the stars and asked what the night sky that the Magi saw might have looked like. If you were there, I hope you'll agree with me that it was a very interesting presentation. One thing that he said that I found very thought-provoking is that Babylon, the place where these wise men came from, had been the home of the Jewish people for a generation, a number of centuries previous, while the people of Israel had been in exile at the command of the Babylonian emperor. Now, you may know from experience that one of the best ways to know about another culture or religion is to get to know someone from that culture who practices that religion. If you get a new next-door neighbor who is a Hindu, for instance, at the very least, you'll begin to notice the times of year when they have family over, when they leave the house to observe festivals, when they put up special decorations. And if you're inquisitive, you may ask why. And if you're really brave, you might even ask them why. At the very least, the Jews in exile must have left something with the people amongst whom they lived. Knowledge of their customs and the God they worshipped. They may have intermarried with Babylonian people even. By the time of the birth of Jesus, these events were all very far in the past, over 500 years, so they were all vague memories. But there could be reasons why people at the court of the Persian king were knowledgeable about the hopes of the Jewish people. This is all conjecture, but it is useful in remembering and causing us to remember that in the story of the Magi, we learn two things. One is the major underlying truth that Jesus and his salvation are intended for all the nations and is open to all the people of all the nations. But we also learn in this story that the people of the nations desire the salvation that Jesus offers, and they come looking for it. They come and they worship and they look for the child who is God. The Magi were searching the skies because they had desires. There were things that they and the people they worked for wanted. Above all, they wanted to know the truth behind the universe, the way the world works and its purposes. Amongst all the possible explanations of the universe that they knew about, one of them was the hopes of a marginal people that they had subjugated in better days. And then, as they were reading the messages of the skies, they happened upon a star that pointed to the land of that marginal people. That star promised to have answers to their longings and desires, so they followed it where it led, even if it meant enduring great hardship and inconvenience. I think this is a useful image for us today as we and our fellow humans all long for the truth of the universe. It's useful because quite often when we hear the biblical language about Jew and Gentile, of believing and not believing, we think of a stark dichotomy. But in reality, things are not so sharply divided. There's a reason our society is called post-Christian. Fragments of Christian belief are embedded everywhere in our society's customs and morals. They're often embedded so deeply that even you or I might not be fully aware that they're there or where they came from. Not unlike the vague remembrances of the Jewish God that these Babylonian magi might have had. This fact is easily illustrated this time of year, as everyone, most of all of us I think, have spent the last month engaging with the rest of our world in the joy and festivity occasioned by a half-remembered truth about the universe. I don't mean that as a criticism of what people call secular Christmas. I love it, and I love almost everything about it. I have a very full stocking at home, which I love very much as well. I even love the fact that the way the holidays are celebrated by the vast majority of people contains disjointed fragments of the Christian story. Now, as a Christian, I'm able to see the ways those fragments hold together. the missing links between the peace, hope, and joy that appears in messages and Christmas cards everywhere, and the Christmas carols that people sing without entirely believing or understanding. The connection between the lights that lighten the darkness, and the gift-giving and the togetherness that people do. You may think the way society celebrates Christmas to be a more flippant example of what I'm talking about, but if you look, the fragments of Christianity are everywhere. The rights of the individual upon which a society is based are very secularized ideas that are rooted in concepts from Christian theology about the dignity, worth, and autonomy of humans created in the image of God. Another example is the fact that people love an underdog, and people accord a lot of respect to victims, which many people have, which is in a direct descendant of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, and so on. A big part of sharing the gospel and the mission of the church is squaring the circle for people by showing them the fullness of the truth of the gospel, which they only know partially and in fragments. That's not to say that preaching the gospel is just convincing people that Christianity is something they already believe and that they can become a Christian without effort. That's not true. There's a gap, quite a significant gap, between the partial fragment and the wholeness. For instance, the flip side of our culture dominated by individual rights is a rigid individualism, which, in my understanding, is contrary to the teachings of the gospel. Being an underdog can be seen as good in itself, which is a problem if you don't think about whether the thing you're an underdog for are good or bad in themselves. Even Christmas suffers from being a collection of fragments. So much of the anxiety about the season that people feel is a result of people not feeling a connection to anything substantial behind the celebration and the merriment. It comes from commercialism being the main thing, and people losing sight of the love and fellowship that's supposed to be the reason for consuming. When the gospel of Jesus is preached and lived out, the gap between the fragments is bridged by more and more truth, by more and more of the fullness of the gospel. The connections between the fragments which were hidden are made evident, and the truth takes its proper shape. It's also important to remember that those who desire to put back together the fragments of the truth that they hold also exist within the walls of the church. If we're being honest, it describes you and me. In today's gospel reading, for instance, we see people who are confused foreigners worshiping God in the manger, and people who are Jesus' co-religionists and countrymen, people with access and knowledge of the prophets, keeping their distance. We all have fragmented understandings of the truth. We're often more sure of the half-remembered customs and morals we receive from wider society than the truth that is found by journeying to Bethlehem. Much of what we're going to be doing over the coming year in these walls is putting those fragments back together. As individuals, we put the fragments back together so that we have a better understanding of the truth of the universe and our place in it. And as a body, as a community, our putting the fragments back together is done so that others who are further off can do the same. What we're going to be doing over the coming calendar year is to do the same thing the Magi did. Because the only way to put the fragments back together, the only way to satisfy our deepest longings, is to make the journey they made. The only way is to find what they found. The child who is the fulfillment of the desires of every person. The child who is the Messiah. To find that child and, as they did, to worship him. Amen.